So welcome everybody. I'm delighted we have a very nice collection of people joined us. I can see who've come online here for this is what's called a round table webinar. Not sure how round all of this is, but yes, this is as round as it gets when you use these online tools. But we have today a fantastic topic. This is a follow-on to a webinar we held a couple of weeks ago where Sergio Fernandez, who's delighted to have him again here today, talked about how Brussels works, how it's all constructed. But this time we're going to actually look a little bit closer. How do we influence legislation? Okay, very interesting topic. A very important one, by the way, despite how it might sound. We have a really interesting panel here today. I'll introduce in a moment, but we're going to really look into the kind of the whole Brussels arena, the political labyrinth of Brussels. How do we influence legislation, regulations, that it really affect all businesses, but particularly we're going to focus in on the secondary market, which those of us who are interested in free ICT understand what it is we're interested in. And I'm delighted to have three excellent contributors today, and we'll be asking them some questions for them, and we'll be able to take your questions as well at the end. We've got an hour booked for this, and we expect the conversation to go on for 40 minutes or so. 45 minutes would allow some time at the end for a couple of questions if there are any. So first of all, let me introduce Mr. Dan Shefford. Dan is originally Danish. He's a Paris-based lawyer, specializes in European human rights law and a very good knowledge of intellectual property rights and particularly information technology law. Dan is actually a speaker in many forums all over the world, but he's also a specialist to UNESCO, and he's the author of the policy options and regulatory mechanisms for managing radicalization on the internet. So he's a particular interest in that area, and is very well renowned and understands policy making and influencing very well. So delighted to have you, Dan. Welcome to this webinar, and lovely to see you again.
Thank you. The same. Good to be here.
Thank you, Dan.
Now, or should I sort of make a small pitch now?
Well, you can make a pitch whenever you like, Dan. I mean, there's no stopping you, as we know.
Well, I'll let you first introduce everybody. I think.
I'll introduce everybody. I'm going to come back to you probably with the first question, Dan, in a moment. But let me introduce Sergio as well. Sergio Fernandez, who did our last webinar and presented the very interesting and complex labyrinth that Brussels and the EU is. Sergio, I know Sergio for a number of years, but Sergio has well over a decade of experience on the ground. He knows what it's really like in Brussels, focused on a whole range of industries, including technology, but also energy, environment, digital, transport, and even the world of sport. He's helped all types of companies, federations, associations, and indeed SMEs understand how do we get involved in the EU legislative debate. And he works for free ICT and has done in the past, which is fantastic. So delighted again, Sergio. Good to have you. Welcome.
Thanks for having me back here. It's a pleasure.
We'll always have you back. There's no doubt about that. And also, finally, we have my good colleague and friend, Jan Hoekstraat. Jan, as well as working and helping Free ICT Europe, Jan has been working with lots and lots of companies for many years. Large business, small business. He's been an advisor and an analyst working with a number of mergers and acquisition projects, business development. And for Free ICT, he is our lead person on the ground in many of the EU activities. Technically, I'm supposed to help him, but I'm a long way far away from his expertise and knowledge, and he's key for our contacts and our alliance partners, which is very much part of our success on the ground in Europe. And he's also heads up our daily operations. So welcome, Jan. How are you?
Well, to be honest, a bit recovering. So if I look tired, it's not because I think the other speakers are are boring, but we'll see to that.
Very good.
Thank you, Thomas. You say I'm on the ground. Well, we are all a bit grounded, but it's great to be connected at least this way.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So the topic we have and a discussion we're going to have here now is it's quite interesting because when we're looking at when you talk to anybody who's not doesn't do this job on a day-to-day basis, but influencing EU policy or influencing EU policy makers, and I'm going to go to you first, Dan, on this topic. It kind of sounds a little bit clandestine and unusual, and we've been doing this, and we have free ICT, and they have this concept of a transparency register, and I mean transparency's got to be critical for this, doesn't it?
Well, I've been working with international institutions and in particular with the Commission for probably two decades now. And I'd just like to say that when you talk about influencing, I think that what we're talking about now is rather participating in the lawmaking process. These seems to be the key words now. It's not so much influencing, also because that has a pretty negative connotation. It sounds like lobbyism. No, what we're really talking about now, and I've seen that over, at least with this commission, and probably over the last, maybe also the former commission, is that this reaching out by the commission in having the member states and the citizens participate in the lawmaking process is something pretty new, and you may call it a consequence of transparency. You may call it a consequence of open government, which was a buzzword some years ago, and is still important to lawmaking also at member state levels. But definitely there is a clear strategy on the part of the Commission to reach out and have everybody within the European Union participate, not influence, but participate in the lawmaking process. Now, that lawmaking process, as you know, is typically regulations and directives, but it may also be at other levels. And when I say the Commission, it actually also includes the European Parliament. Unfortunately, it doesn't include right now the Council of Ministers, and probably will never, because that's a member state. That's a member state jurisdiction, quote unquote. But clearly, from the Commission, they're calling on submissions. I've made quite a few submissions on IP matters, on competition law matters, and on the Digital Services Act right now. And not only is the Commission reaching out in the name, again, of transparency and citizens' participation, but they actually also pay attention to what they receive. They respond, and they actually read the stuff. And it clearly, to me, over the past decades, I've seen over at least the last 5 years, and maybe even more with the Commission that we have now, it works, and it's taken very seriously, and it's the way it should work. So bravo, kudos to the Commission, and I hope that they'll continue this trend.
Very good, and I'm it's an obvious next person to go to on this topic because you're on the ground, Sergio, in doing this. Do you find that there? I mean, in the decade or so that you've been doing this, has there been more requirements or less requirements on this transparency area? Are you pushed in this area more now than you were before?
Definitely, and to add on what Dan just said, I think there is as well another variable here. That's the fact that a lot of criticism has been addressed to the EU. We had the last few years the rise of extremism and populism parties across Europe. In Eastern Europe or even in Western Europe. So those measures to increase transparency have as well the goal to kind of tackle this issue and a bit to try to cut let's say arguments from those populist party that are raising always the fact that the EU is a distinct institution with using the words of technocracy or those kind of things. So it's just a thought to complement what Dan was saying. On the ground, typically since 2019, there are new rules. Like Dan was saying, those rules they are applying only to the Commission and to the European Parliament, but it's clearly an increase of transparency, because right now, if you take all the key decision makers, when there is a proposal of legislation in the European Parliament, including then the rapporteur, the shadows, and the committee chairs, they have to publicly highlight which lobbyists and which people they met during their work and their legislative work on the report. So this is I think a good starting point, and it's worth noting as well that the industry, let's say the lobbying industry in Brussels has been quite active on this topic, pushing for more transparency. Given there are some, let's say, some good reasoning behind, as you said, as you mentioned earlier, Thomas. It's an industry that is sometimes, let's say, as kind of a shadow around this industry. So it's a way for them as well to show that they want to play by the rules. They are democratic. They are actors of the democracy, helping, let's say, third parties and the stakeholders to be part of the debate. So it's a good step forward, and let's see in the future how those let's say those rules are going to be implemented, and if they are planning to go forward as well.
Good, yeah, and despite and with that, it's still possible to have success. I'm thinking of some of the success. I'm going to go to Jan now on this one, because actually you were actively involved in that. The Eco Design Directive that is very important to our industry, particularly in terms of the openness it creates and the assistance it gives to our industry and to the users of the secondary market for certain technology stacks in business, to have choice and availability of parts and rules around that. That was a journey you were on, Jan, and you were very close to it over a number of years. Some of the things that Dan and Sergio are describing there, how did that feel on the ground when you were on that journey to getting the Eco Design Directive kind of brought to the forefront?
Well, then to start with the topic around transparency, you see at our website and in our email communication always that we have our own identity, so our own transparency number. So with all the participations that we make in the different processes or consultations that we give, we always have to file our numbers, so that can also always be traceable. And also the EU is facilitating that on a good way with ICT systems that are involved in this. If I look on the process under eco design in the first years, it was of course step by step, sometimes consultation and not so much communication in between. And what we saw happening this year, after a couple of months, because the communication was in February and March, April was everybody was very much focused on the changing world and the new setup. What we also saw is that there was more openness to communicate by email, and of course having some more calls than before that, also with the people involved with the eco design total setup, I have to say. So I think that's you can see that it looks on different ways that the doors are a bit more open. There's more dialogue, and we did provide that way also some more information, not just by writing a paper, having a formal consultation, but also because some questions are now able to be answered just directly, and there's a more open communication.
Actually, I think it's probably helped smaller organizations. The transparency allows smaller organizations like Free ICT really to get a foothold in there, which is probably something that would be more challenging if there was less transparency and a lot more kind of opaque scenarios going on. I picked up something you were talking about, Sergio, earlier. I'll go back to you on what I would describe as the diversity in Parliament, which is seems far greater now. And I'm wondering, how does that impact the ability of, and I can't remember the phrase, Dan, you used earlier, you didn't say influencing, participation, participation, as Dan described it, the participation in the process of policy making and policymakers. How's it changed, or has it?
Yeah. So basically, if you just look at at concrete numbers, and you will be able to understand the current situation. That is, let's say, that's like what you can see at national level. I mean, those traditional parties have been decreasing, and you had the rise of alternative parties. That could be the Greens, that could be populist parties as well, or maybe more liberals in the case of France, for example. Basically, if you take the former European Parliament, so between 2014 and 2019, almost 55% of the parliament were composed of the EPP group and the S&D group. So I mean, it's center right and center left. So the two basic political parties that you can find, that everyone can find in their at their national level. So to build a compromise, it was quite easy. If you had the S&D and the EPP on board, basically it was a good game for you, and your provision was going to be in the final compromise of a text. In the current parliament, so until 2024, the EPP and the S&D, they account only for 45% of the MEPs. So it's slightly a decrease. And at the same time, if we take the former parliament, you had zero party that were accounting, except of course the EPP and the S&D. You had zero party that was accounting for more than 10% of the number of MEPs. And in the current parliament, you have now 3 additional parties that are above this 10%. So you have the Liberals that are basically 15% approximately, and you have let's say the Identity and Democracy, which is the far right party, that is around 10%, and the Green parties that is around 10%. So okay. The current parliament is even more based on building a compromise and on trying to reach, let's say, a broader coalition to make your point in. So to answer to your question, let's say that I think that the new parliament leaves more door open to push for your positioning, and you are able to see that in the current actions we are doing, how you can let's say use several leverages to push for just an example, but the inclusion of software in the circular economy action plan, for example. You see that with this variety of political parties that are involved, it's easier to bring a topic into the table of the discussions, and it should be as well a bit easier to let's say to have that in the final report, because if before you had to convince the S&D and the EPP, now you have let's say more room of maneuver, because if you don't have one of these on board, you can still reach a majority. by convincing others.
It sounds like it's even a little slightly more democratic, for sure. Yeah, that sounds interesting. I'm wondering though. That's the Parliament. The Commission is kind of made up of probably slightly different actors. And Dan, I know you've done a lot of work in France on with French policymakers and French legislators, and many people in France, I'm sure, end up in, if they're not MEPs, but if they're involved in politics in France, they may well end up in the influential positions in the Commission or elsewhere across Brussels. And obviously, as a Dane, you may, and you probably know a lot more people. Do you have a view on what Sergio is describing there, a more diverse Parliament? What does that? Do you have a view on what that might do for the Commission, and then how one might go about participating in the Commission conversation? Do you have a view on that?
A view on other member states having representatives as commissioners? Is that it?
No, I'm talking specifically about how one might influence the Commission, given now the kind of slightly mixed makeup of the Parliament, but that may not be reflected immediately in how the Commission is structured.
Well, again, of course there is influence, but I really think that it's not just to be clever that I go back to the term that I like more, which is participation. I really think that is what it is now. And of course, from the citizens' perspective, it's very much participation, right? But from the Parliament perspective, it may be more active than just participation. Absolutely right. I think that the way the Commission works now is that we have some very clear mission statements. Those mission statements are given out by the president of the Commission to the vice presidents, and then we're given down further down. And we know very, very clearly now who's in charge of what. And it's more on that level than it is the national who knows whom level and the parliamentary, again, who knows whom level, that I think that the participation will be crystallized in the future. For once, we have very, very, very clear mission statements, and to a certain extent they are overlapping, but we also know more or less who's in charge. I mean, Thierry Breton is in charge of the Digital Services Act, and Margrethe Vestager is in charge of competition, and very, very clearly we know that if we have one of those subjects that we want to participate in, we know whom to contact as who's in charge. Sometimes it'll be direct, sometimes it'll be through members of the European Parliament. This is also part of the transparency, that we really know who is in charge. But there's one thing that I also wanted to mention, Thomas, is that when we talk about the European institutions, we talked about European Parliament, we talked about very, very quickly about the Council of Ministers, and we've also talked about the Commission. There is one institution that we haven't talked about, and that is the European Union Court of Justice, which is extremely important. And fortunately, I may say that I've never heard anybody talking about the risk of influencing the judges with the European Union Court of Justice, which is very, very interesting, because coming to think about it, it shows how different the European Union Court of Justice is from the Supreme Court in the US, for instance. We know very much that the Supreme Court in the US, we saw that with the latest decisions of the Trump administration to have a certain justice elected just before he would be voted out of office, if ever he will accept that he was. And so we know that there are political inclinations with the Supreme Court of the US, conservative, liberal, call them whatever you want. We don't see that at all with the European Union Court of Justice. In the founding years of the European Union Court of Justice, which I would say goes back to the 60s and the early 70s, we saw an almost aggressive strategy by some of the judges in terms of integration. It was especially what we call the French and the Italian judges who were very much for integration. And they came up with some of the most important decisions in terms of the primacy of EU law over even constitutional law. We have some leading cases involving Italy and Germany from those years. And once that was done, once the legal hierarchy was in place, we've seen that the European Union Court of Justice simply applies the law as it is, typically through prejudicial questions, and it becomes very much like a cassation court, like we know in France. I think it's very much it speaks very much to the importance of the rule of law and the respect for democracy in the European Union, that we don't have a Supreme Court like in the US, which is which is openly politically driven. So I
But
just
if you,
wanted to make that remark, because sometimes you see at member state court cases that try to launch strategic litigation in order to arrive at some case law with the European Union Court of Justice, and it simply doesn't work.
wow, okay. I mean, the obvious question is, if you think about it, we all know, well, we know many of the Supreme Court judges in the United States. I couldn't name a single judge on the European Court of Justice. You're a lawyer, I'm sure you could, but maybe we should be able to know. We should know who they are, should we not? Or maybe no. What do you think of that? I mean, we don't know. As European citizens do not know the names of whereas a U.S. citizen might know, and was highly likely to know the names of one or two of the U.S. Supreme Court.
That's also because we have a tradition in Europe, which is that we don't deliver dissenting opinions, which is very, very important. This is a civil law tradition. Is very much French inspired. We don't have dissenting opinions. We have dissenting opinions in the U.S., and sometimes the dissenting opinions are much more interesting than the judgment as such. But in Europe, we view the court as an institution more than a number of personal judges. So a decision is rendered by the court, and whether it was 5-4 or 9-3 or whatever it was, we will never know. And we will also not know what these secret deliberations were all about, what the dissenting opinions were all about, which again speaks to the credit of the rule of law in European Union, because how will you influence the judge if you don't know what his position was? So all of that, I think, is very, very important. Just wanted to mention that in terms of the transparency of the European Union. You can certainly participate in lawmaking at the European Commission level and the European Parliament level, and maybe through Parliament you can also maybe more or less easily reach out to some national members, and maybe not. But the legal strategy of trying to influence laws through strategic litigation in member states doesn't work.
Yeah, and we do know many of the players. It's unusual now because we wouldn't have many years ago as many. The commission, go back to the commission where we do know the names. We know you mentioned Margrethe Vestager and you mentioned Thierry Breton. We obviously, I mean, those of us in Ireland feel like we know Michel Barnier better than we know anybody else in negotiating the Brexit negotiations that are going on at the moment. And clearly, even though she's relatively new, we know Ursula von der Leyen. I'm wondering, is that I'm actually maybe a question to you, Sergio, as on the ground as a participant in Brussels. Are these is knowing the individuals important? What are they like? Is that a part of your strategy? Do you have to figure out who they are, what their background is? How do you go about dissecting, an individual commissioner or the commission itself? Or where do you go? Where do you start?
Oh, that's a good and a tricky question to be honest, because basically, or you have a personal contact with the person directly, and then of course you know what could be our favorite color, our favorite hobby, or stuff like that. If you don't have a personal contact, then it's going to be based on your what I call the secondary network. So someone that you know that might know this person, or things that you could find online or stuff like that. Because I think that nowadays, if you just look on the internet, you can find pretty much a lot of things on public figures such as politicians. So I don't know how many kids von der Leyen has, for example, or what are the favorite meal of Madame Vestager, those kind of things. You can find that right now. It's always, in the game of influence, and or I should say participation.
That's all right. Participate.
Yep.
in this game, it's always, let's say, a bonus to be. I will use the term familiar, but I will say more close to your interlocutor. I mean, for example, and this is a special trick I used to. I try to use as much as possible is when I'm speaking, for example, to a French MEP, I'm going to speak to him in French. If it's a Spanish MEP, it's going to be in Spanish. I mean, for example, using their own language, it's always a plus. I try always to dig a bit in the personal background of the people we are going to meet, because it's quite easy then to create a sort of sympathy. For example, it's not unusual to have someone that went to the same school as one of my clients, for example, or that work in the same company. It could be 20 years ago, but since even like that, it creates kind of a sympathy, and let's say participation / influence remains an interpersonal approach. So if you can create sympathy with someone, it's always a plus for you. And you have seen that, I'm sure, over the course of the years you have been doing this as well.
Yeah, and you want to say something on this?
Yeah, I thought because this is, of course, a way that we all try to do. But also the question was, it's who are the if you look at the key actors, of course we look at the Timmermans, Verstager, etc. But are they really for us the key actors? And that's reminded me that. A couple of weeks ago, we were in a meeting in which Vice President Timmermans was also present, and in his talk, it's just the same message as of the last 6, 7, 8 months. The only new thing that he did share in this working group was that he became a granddad a couple of weeks before that, and for the rest, his contribution was close to zero, because everything he shared was really not the message that we want to hear. So the key actors that we speak to in Brussels are not so much on the side of the Commission. The commissioners, it's the levels below. So under the commissioner, you have the DGs. Under that, you have directors, and actually under the level under that, those are the guys that are communicating with each other. Those are really interacting, and those are the sources that we need to talk to. And that's I think if you talk about the key actors, they should be named the ones.
That's really good, yeah, because we've painted now the picture in Brussels. We've painted the picture of the kind of the institutions, the framework around participation and transparency, and now we've got into the people a little bit there. I think that's very helpful. Actually, you brought it down to the truth is, on the ground, you're not dealing with Thierry Breton or Timmermans. You're dealing with there are many levels below them, because that's where you have to operate, and that's where the action is. That was very difficult. There's huge briefs possible for somebody at their level to be involved in any great detail, other than, so they have to rely on their staff. But it would be interesting now as you're talking there, Jan, with that framework and that kind of, we've built the structure. What are the things that they're working on that are important to Free ICT Europe and important to the secondary market, that we think that are currently active and that are going to be active over the next 12 months?
Yeah, so on a high level, there are a few elements that are, let's say, already in place. We talked about eco-design before, and I truly hope that everybody listening is aware about the things we were participating in, the service and storage, the firmware discussion that's going on. So this is the real tool that was able to connect our issues with the political agenda and the lawmaking in that way. So there are a few things that are already lined up in there. So the review of service and storage will be initiated. There's also another product group in the ICT area, smartphones, that a study has been started. So that's coming up. New requirements will be set. New lawmaking will be coming up. Another thing that's already in place is green public procurement. So we have on the ICT level public procurement for computers, laptops, monitors. That's one group, and the other group is data center products and services. And up till now, that was not of the highest importance because it was just it's no law. It was just more or less an advice to public procurement. And the Commission has now, as part of the Green Deal, mentioned that they want to strengthen this and make certain elements of this become mandatory. So in here we are, we need to speed up as well. Also, good developments in the talks around this. For instance, to have a percentage of the investments of the procurement to be done in second-hand and refurbished IT. So that's a great development. On the bigger picture, we are talking about, Sergio mentioned the circular action plan. So that's a new plan around what actions to be taken into account for the next 4 years, and that's a whole group of actions, more or less. So in there we talk about the review of the eco-design, new products of the eco-design. Right to repair is coming up and will be definitely be put on the agenda. We're looking into this. The circular electronics initiatives is part of that. Sustainable products initiative, another way to look. Okay, besides eco-design, what else can be done to make sure that the products that are entering the market in Europe are becoming more sustainable and more circular. And in there as well, the attention for obsolescence and the impact of software on the life cycle of products. So in there, the core element that maybe also a part of the Green Deal in this is that there's made a shift like 4, 5, 6 years ago that the main interest was to reduce energy consumption of products on the market. While now it's becoming clear that the planet does not have enough resources if we keep having the same way of treating our products and buying, and so the decoupling of the consumption, and so that's an important thing. I quickly go to mention ICT, and there's an ICT study that took place already, started a couple of months ago. That's been elevated. So the Commission is clearly looking on ICT as a whole sector in which they want to make progress. So another institution then, the GRC, Joint Resource Center. So that's the research center of the EU. Will take this up and step up to do this. And so that's an important element for our community, and we will participate as a stakeholder in this. And I will end with some skeptical things that are going on. So for a number of products, there are at the moment voluntary agreements. So there's no law in place. It's just an agreement made up by the industry itself. So that's the case for imaging printers, or for telecom and broadband equipment. It's for around data centers or game consoles. And we see that are being put more and more question marks because, of course, those agreements, give good results at some point. But let's be honest, we need to speed up the way we are handling our planet, and there's probably going to be more influence from the EU on those.
And there may well be less transparency in those type of agreements, indeed, as we talked about earlier. And it's important that they happen. I was listening to you there talk about quite a lot of stuff that's going on there, Jan, and it sure keeps you busy. But I know this topic comes up regularly, and I'd be interested in your view, Dan, on this. What Jan mentioned there a couple of times in his kind of run through was software. We mentioned firmware in the Eco Design Directive, which is a type of software. We mentioned software as well, and we know every single piece of technology now we have, whether it's in the ICT space or not, has got software on it. This is really becoming a big issue, isn't it? Software rights, and you have some thoughts on this. I've spoken before about this.
Well, first of all, Jan, thank you very much. I think it was very useful that you sort of ran through some of the current legislation that's in the works right now will affect the ICT. One of the initiatives that you did not mention, and that was on purpose, I know that, is the Digital Services Act, which of course is a vast bit of legislation coming out. Most probably we'll know more about it in the beginning of December or mid-December. That's at least what I've heard from the Commission. And it'll have an enormous impact on not just e-commerce and indirectly privacy and general data protection also. It will have an effect on that also, but it'll certainly also have an effect on intellectual property rights directly, and thereby also on software. Now, what we've seen from the Commission so far seems to be a bit contradictory, because I think everybody remembers the debate that we had with the Intellectual Property Directive, and the sky is falling, that suddenly there were uploading filters that needed to monitor whether violations of copyright took place and so on. So everyone was shouting and screaming about this. Of course, the sky hasn't fallen, everybody is still alive, but and uploading filters are in place. France already transposed that directive as the first country. So that goes in the direction of stronger copyright protection, right? At the same time, what we hear from the Commission in terms of the Digital Services Act, which again we will hopefully know more about in a couple of weeks, is, for instance, that data will have to be licensed for free to competitors. That's extremely interesting, and we all know why the European Commission wants to do that, because the European Commission, of course, wants, from an industrial point of view and from a sovereignty point of view, to have a European Facebook and a European Google and so on and so forth. Perfectly understandable strategy. And in order to arrive at that, we also understand that we need the data, and so far Europe cannot in any way catch up with the US and with China if we were to start from scratch and try to collect all the data that they have, which is necessary for artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. Therefore, as far as we understand, the Commission will come up as part of the Digital Services Act with a compulsory free licensing scheme for data. So there is a contradiction here, right? Because data is also something which is protected by intellectual property, by the database directive, but it is an intellectual property. So at one and the same time, we have uploading filters in the intellectual property directive, which strengthens copyright protection, and at the same time, we have this new drive in the Digital Services Act, which goes the other way. It'll be extremely interesting to see how this will play out. I believe that we will see that the latter will be stronger than the former. In other words, that we will open up for easier access, or you may also frame it another way, a limitation of certain copyrights that we have today. First of all, affecting the internet, not only with IPAs and so on, but also ultimately software. And there was a very interesting case, let me just finish on that, because I mentioned the European Union Court of Justice, which, even though it is not a political body, comes out with some cases that are extremely important for not only the integration of the European Union, but also for business law in that sense of the word in general. This is a case that came down just the day before yesterday, and involved a prejudicial request from a German court. And it was from a German hotel owner against Booking.com. The problem was a bit complicated because it had to do with jurisdiction by the German courts against Booking.com, which is based in the Netherlands and not in Germany. But the point was that the European Court of Justice actually agreed with the plaintiff insofar as it gave the plaintiff the right to take legal action against Booking.com in Germany, and not at the choice of venue in the contract, with Booking.com, which would have been the Netherlands, because it was said that German competition law was mandatory, and that the contract in question was non-negotiable, and it was a consequence of Booking.com's dominant position. Very, very interesting, because I could see that spill over into license agreements in the software industry, where some of the software copyright holders indisputably hold a dominant position, and that some of their restrictions may now be, by virtue of this case, at least in terms of jurisdiction, subject to censorship by the local courts.
Yeah, because it does sound, I'm just trying to think in layman or more practical terms, it does sound like we know the use of software by the intellectual property right holders can often lead to restrictions. Some of them may be legitimate, but many of them, in our opinion, are not. They're commercial restrictions to prevent repair, perhaps, prevent resale, and ultimately they are controlling the life cycle of the product. And this has a knock-on effect on sustainability of the products, because they're pulled from the market earlier, and it creates a huge amount of unnecessary waste. But it sounds to me like if your prediction is that perhaps the Digital Services Act is going to loosen some of these, that could have a very positive impact on the restrictions that are there through software. Because really, software is a mechanism now. I mean, we're looking at intellectual property rights that are they 70 years or more for products that are of a shelf life of 10 years at most, maybe 12. So it does seem to me that loosening is going to be a very positive thing. All right.
A combination of competition law and this trend of loosening up copyright protection as a consequence of the Digital Services Act, I think that is what we will see happening.
Yeah. And speaking
sorry, Thomas, you're asking all the questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a panel, so I feel free.
That's my job, Jan. But go ahead.
But then, software is to most of us, and then the members in the parliament and everybody, we just think about an MS Office program or anything like that. But I think during these times, everybody's becoming more and more aware and more precise about what it really is. So we see like firmware is being called machine code, and we more or less we see also appearing that software itself is also it's nothing more than a code that's being put together. In that way. How's the perception changing towards what software is? Of course, we saw the case that software has become tradable in some circumstances, right requirements. But how do you think this will proceed? Will there be a change of view on also the power of the vendor, of the developer around the software?
Well, we had all these discussions. So I think that also started in the 60s and the 70s. We had some Supreme Court cases in the US as to whether software was copyright protectable or not, given that there were mathematical formulas and code, and there was nothing creative in that. This was the big discussion. And whether they should only be protectable through patents because they were of a technical nature. Some of the court cases, some of the lawyers, and you can imagine who they represented, said that you cannot gain copyright or any other protection to a mathematical equation. So this was kind of like what you're referring to here. I don't think that we're going back to that discussion again. The decision was made back then that software is indeed eligible for copyright protection and also for patent protection, which creates its own legal difficulty sometimes, because you could have the same bit of code that has double protection. But I don't think that we're going back to that. But we are definitely moving towards some more open licensing. We have some very important cases involving IPAs now. Google Oracle, we'll see what comes out of that. Again, some people are shouting and screaming that the sky is falling. I don't think that will fall anywhere. But the reason I mention this is that it's pretty fundamental stuff that we see going on right now. We may revise the duration of protection, as Thomas just referred to. We may see, and that's very realistic. I think it'll be also even more realistic to assume that whatever intellectual property right regime we will apply to software, compulsory licensing will be more and more common. Again, we see that in terms of data in the Digital Services Act. Very interesting, because that compulsory licensing scheme, as far as I know, but I haven't seen the draft yet, seems to be free of charge. I mean, that's very, very interesting. We have compulsory licensing schemes in the drug industry. We had them for a number of years. And even drug manufacturers, if they are subject to compulsory licensing, that may happen to the COVID-19 vaccine in Africa, for instance, they will actually receive some sort of symbolic payment for it. So it'll be very interesting to see whether the DSA, if compulsory licensing will be free, will be challenged before court, being a violation of the protection of property rights. But that's of course a different discussion. But I think that we are moving towards shorter periods and more compulsory licensing, with or without symbolic licensing fees. And that as a consequence, again, of European industrial policy and the clear need for Europe to try and catch up with, again, China and the US on data. And that, as a consequence, will lead to legal doctrine of a more general nature.
There's a lot of things happening here, and I'm wondering, does this, and you combine all of these things with even the likes of Brexit and some of the major changes that are happening with regards to the EU budget. Is there, Sergio, I'm interested in your view, you're on the ground in Brussels. Do you feel the EU is more trusted today or less trusted? I mean, I know they do surveys on these things every now and again. Did they not have one recently? What's your view on the ground with this stuff, with trust?
Yeah, just a quick comment, because I liked the comment that Dan just made on this contradiction that you can see when we are talking about the Commission, and it's as well linked to the way it functions. Jan was mentioning earlier the fact that it's let's say a technocratic structure where let's say policy officers and head of units, they are the one with let's say the technical knowledge in a way, whereas like commissioners, they are more the ones with the political background, let's say. It's important to have always that in mind, because a funny thing to always remember when we are talking about the European Commission is that the number of civil servants the European Commission has, it's around 35,000. So that's basically the exact same number as a city like Rotterdam, for example, in the Netherlands. So it's always you always need to keep that in mind. So you have the same number of civil servants to rule an entire continent. So that's why they cannot know everything. That's why they are so open to listen to third parties. And that's why sometimes they make some weird decisions.
Yeah.
Because the only one they are talking to could be, let's say, industry players. And this is critical as well for the good functioning of the EU, to have more actors involved, to have an increase of the participation. And that's where like an organization like yours, and I'm sure you are well placed to do that if you just look at the journey you made since you started to come to Brussels, how things have evolved and your perception, and you can see that only by participating, by engaging with people, you already had some good wins. Of course, it can always be better. There are some other battles to fight, but it's participation here in the decision-making process. Is really important, and I encourage all the organization, all the people that are listening to us today to to try to participate as much as possible in public consultations, in every let's say every leverage offered by the institution to do so. To come back to your question, trust.
Well, actually, Sergio, I was going to say to you, there is a question, and you've just answered it. I hope, from one of our attendees around the kind of participation description. And I think you've answered it quite well there in terms of what. And I hope that's Dan was. I think that's what you meant by participation, Dan. Isn't that right?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, so that was a question actually that came through from one of the attendees. So hopefully that's answered that. Yeah, I did ask you about. Yeah, I mean that. A lot of what we're talking about is how do you get trust? Because if you can't trust the system on our side, it's hard to participate for everybody.
But this is a hard question, I think, because I agree on Dan on the topic that the institution have been implementing over the last course of years several tools to increase participation and then trust in their work. But let's say that the world we are living in currently makes everything around trust more difficult. I know that some of us discussed about the social dilemma, the documentary, and if you just see our social networks, our politicians at national level, they are kind of using fake news. They are let's say turning and shaping their own truth the way they want to they want to have those elements. Makes it hard for the citizen to trust the system and to trust the work of the institutions. And personally, I don't have the miracle solution on that. I think that the Commission has done its part of the job to try to let's say to be seen as a more trustful organization, but other players need to do the work as well. And I'm especially thinking at the member states, because yet it's going to be different, of course, depending the member states, but usually national governments have the tendency to blame the Commission and the EU for laws they agreed.
Yeah, well, we always like to have somebody to blame. I'm going to give the last word to you, Dan, and I'd like you maybe to we're getting into that time of year where we do crystal ball gazing, and the future. We won't talk about COVID, but in the EU, the journey of policy decisions. What's going to happen in the future? What will the landscape look like? And what can we expect from the Commission and the Parliament and the EU in terms of its impact on the digital landscape over the next 12, 24, 36 months?
Well, I think in terms of digital landscapes, definitely the Digital Services Act, which I mentioned a few times, and I hope that we shall see the draft in December, is going to be a milestone. It's going to replace the e-commerce directive from 20 years ago, and it's going to shape EU policy for many, many years, probably another 20 years to come in the digital world. And that means really, the future. I mean, there's nothing that denotes the future more than the digital world. It's a complete paradigm shift. So that is going to be extremely important. It won't just be one act, of course. There'll be lots of laws in the member states. There'll be directives, regulations. But this will be the main thrust of what we will see. At the same time, I think that the European Commission has learned a lot from Brexit. And the trend that we saw, and I referred to before in the early 60s and even in the 70s, in terms of integration, very much driven by the European Union Court of Justice in those days. I think that the Commission will be much more careful with integration. This this fact that the European Commission serves as a scapegoat is clearly something that is going to continue and maybe even grow. Social media will help a lot with that, which is of course ironical, because nothing really happens unless the Council of Ministers agree. But we all know the political game. So I think the European Commission will be very careful in terms of further integration, which may be perceived as running counter to the national governments of the member states. I think that they'll also be very careful in terms of their application of human rights. It's a bit the same thing as I just said, but I want to give that perspective. We've seen cases of the European Commission using the fundamental rights of the Charter to impose certain restrictions on Poland and Hungary, and very dangerous, very, very, very dangerous, because we've got certain very nationalistic sentiments in those countries, and they may find some breathing space here for a Brexit kind of initiative in their countries, saying that the European Commission is deciding how the judiciary should work in their own country, and so on and so forth. And it's even worse in their terms than the European Court of Human Rights. I think that the Commission will be very careful in applying those judgments, and maybe leave more and more to the European Court of Human Rights.
Very good.
Which is much less political, and will certainly not be misused by certain countries to say it is European Commission's fault. So less integration, leaving much more independence to the sovereign member states, and then move ahead on some of the key points, which is really the digital future, which is the future. I think the last thing that I would mention is the European Commission has to work out a coherent scheme in terms of cryptocurrencies and use of blockchains. I don't see that, and I haven't heard that as being part of the Digital Services Act, but the European Commission certainly has to come up with some very, very, very clear guidelines or regulations on the use of blockchains, and in particular cryptocurrencies, because that again is definitely the future. And we cannot, we have a euro currency for most of the countries, but we don't yet have a cryptocurrency. And I think that that's going to be a major competitive disadvantage for the European Union in the future.
Well, it certainly sounds to me that there is a lot going to happen. There's a lot happening as we know it. Thank you, gentlemen. Dan, Sergio, Jan, thank you very much. I found the conversation really interesting. I hope the people participated, joined us, also found it. You're listening to the playback. I hope you enjoyed it. We will have another one. Jan, I think we have you possibly with me again in January. We get into a little bit of more detail about what's actually going to be happening within pre-ICT on the ground in Brussels. A little bit more detail around that.
So they shouldn't miss it. Yeah, that's the real message going. Sorry.
No. That's the real. It's the climax. That's in. I don't have the date in front of me, Jan, but I think it's in the
19th as well.
19th of January. 19th of January. So, listen, gentlemen, great to talk to you. Thank you all, and thanks to those of you who came to listen to us. We will see you very, very soon. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye.